He's also
All right, it's 9:01. I'm going to call this meeting to order. And Ms. Willis, would you like to call the planning board to order?
Yes, ma'am, I'd like to call the planning board to order.
Okay, everyone stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next, we have the approval of the agenda. Does council have a motion?
I move that we approve the agenda as proposed.
Second.
All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Planning board?
I move, do I have a motion to approve the agenda for the meeting, please?
So moved.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Agenda approved.
All right, thank you. Amending the flex code. Mr. Ben, you in charge?
I just want to give some opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to the experts. First of all, thank you. Thank you for your time this morning. It's not usual that we have a joint meeting like this, but the purpose of this meeting is to talk about some updates to our flex code. Our flex code is a form-based code that the town first adopted in the mid-2010s. Leland was one of the first in the state to adopt such a code. It's a little bit different than a typical zoning code, and we're starting to see some realizations of this code. This building itself is built to the flex code requirements, the brewery across the street, the Habitat store under construction. You're going to learn a little bit more about that in this presentation today. So what we're presenting to you is some proposed updates to this code. As we have been thinking about how to implement this great vision from our 2045 plan, this is one of those ways to do that. So today you'll hear a presentation from Mr. Ben Watts. He's going to go over what kind of more about what the flex code is, what's proposed to be changed. Also with us today, to my left here, is Susan Henderson from Placemakers. She was one of the people who really helped get this code implemented for the town in the first place, and she's been our go-to consultant as we've been working through these updates. So please feel free to give your feedback today. Again, the purpose is to present this to you, to hear your feedback, so that we can understand how to move forward with what we're proposing. So with that, thanks again, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben Watts.
While we're waiting on Ben, welcome back, Susan.
Good morning, Madam Mayor, Town Council, and Planning Board.
Morning, Ben.
Thank you for joining me. And excuse me on this presentation. I'm only about a fourth of the way through my cup of coffee. Before I started off, I just wanted to give a big thank you to Ashley Barefoot. She's done a tremendous amount of work on this project so far. Unfortunately, she can't be here today, but I'm sure she's watching from home. If you guys know or don't know, she just had her baby Charlie. So big congratulations to her.
Who, Ashley?
Ashley.
I never knew.
What? Well, that's why she couldn't be here today.
Y'all
but
just hide this stuff too much.
It's been a very trying last 4 months, man. Our attention on other things.
Man.
But yeah, she's been instrumental in these flex code updates. So brief agenda here. We're going to go over a little bit of background about the flex code, how it started, where we're at today. We're going to talk about what the flex code is, why we need an update. We're going to go into some of those code updates, and then I'd like to have a discussion towards the end. There's about 50 slides here, so please, as you have questions, stop me, and I'll try to answer them as we go. A lot of the flex code builds on each other, so if you have a question early on, ask it so we can get that understanding. It'll probably come in handy a little bit later in the presentation. So the town's original 2009 master land use plan recommended the flex code implementation as a tool for smart growth and as a way to better manage the anticipated growth in the town. It was originally adopted in 2011, but it was used as an optional ordinance. And it wasn't until 2013 with the Gateway Infill Plan where it was adopted and the required ordinance in our Gateway District. So at this point, it's over 10 years old, and we have seen a little more interest in the flex code development outside of our Gateway District in areas that we refer to as greenfield development, where there's currently no existing development, which is one of the reasons that it needs an update. So what is the flex code? So we have conventional zoning. Those are our R6, R15, R20 residential districts, and C1, C2 are commercial districts. Under conventional zoning, the use comes first. We separate the uses out. You live over here, you play over here, you work over here, and you buy all your stuff over there. So it's very separated out. The management of the use is secondary, and the form of the use is tertiary. So use first, form last. In the flex code, it's kind of turning that conventional zoning on its head. The form comes first, how the buildings and structures look, how it interacts with the pedestrian, how it interacts with the streetscape. The use is secondary, and the management of that use is tertiary. The flex code is split up into transects, and these transects are just a gradient from rural to urban. So our T1 would be our most rural transect currently. In those areas you would see larger swaths of land protected, kind of like our conservation zoning district. As you go down the transect, you get your typical rural single-family neighborhoods and locales. Moving on up, you get your more structured subdivision type development. And as you progressively get towards the more urban areas, you see that mix of commercial uses and residential come together. So the flex code is a progressive and unique approach. It places importance on creating streets that are also public spaces because they're user-friendly for the pedestrians as well as the vehicles. It also prioritizes the form of the building first. It is a time-tested approach. If we look back at well-developed and long-established areas, this is the type of development practices that they used. Downtown Savannah, Southport, Alexandria, Virginia, essentially any historic downtown area that you like to visit, that's what the flex code is getting at. It fosters development that implements our Leland 2045. All 6 planning themes fully support the type of development that the flex code advances. It creates livable communities for people of all ages. It ensures that everything you could need is within walking distance, reducing reliance on the automobile. And it gives shorter travel distances to the basic needs and your daily needs, the drugstore, the grocery store, public spaces, parks. It better protects our cultural and natural resources. It does this by centering development in areas that are less environmentally sensitive and promoting infill development. Provides a higher level of public amenities. There's various types of civic spaces that are allowed and are appropriately scaled based on the context they exist in. These civic spaces are required. We'll kind of get to that a little bit later in the presentation. And it provides development that's a little more flexible. So for example, if someone builds a multifamily structure and the market changes and all of a sudden they realize, hey, the first floor of this could be commercial space. Well, it allows them to transfer from residential use to commercial space by right, so they can better respond to the changes in the market. So we'll go into the Flex Code update. We're going to touch on all 10 of these things. We'll hit back to this agenda as we go through it. The first of which is clarification of process and administrative procedures. So currently there's 3 ways you can utilize the Flex Code. You can rezone to Flex Code Zone or FCZ. You could rezone directly to Transect districts as part of an infill community plan. That's what we have over here with the Gateway District. Or you can rezone to standalone Transect districts. We'll go into each one of these. All 3 of these options at the onset require both Planning Board and Town Council approvals. So rezoning to the Flex Code Zone, FCZ. The first step in that would be a Planning Board recommendation and Town Council approval. The second step for an applicant would be for them to submit a new community plan. And that new community plan essentially is akin to a master land use plan and a PUD, but with a lot more specificity and restrictions. After they receive TRC review and approval for that new community plan, they can move on to subdivisions and development site plans, which, as all of you know, also go back through that TRC review and approval. So a new community plan is approved administratively by the TRC. And it's a good idea to do this administratively because the way this code is written, it offers great predictability for the type of development allowed once Town Council approves a rezoning to Flex Code Zone. As an example of this predictability, when you submit a new community plan, you have to do so within the bounds of the ordinance, and the ordinance specifies what percentages of each transect classification you can have. So if you remember back to the transect flow chart, you have to have a certain portion of your land area T1 natural zone. You have to have a certain portion of your land area T2, T3, all the way up to your T5 or T5 open. Those percentages are specified in the ordinance, and people, despite initiating a new community plan and being able to alter which transect zones they might have in which areas, they still have to stick to those predetermined guidelines.
Ben,
Yes.
I'm sorry, before we go forward. So, if I'm thinking of, I'm a developer and I'm thinking of rezoning to the Flex Code Zone, I go through the Planning Board and I go through Town Council approval. Do those percentages, is that part of the approval process, or does that not come into play until the community plan?
That would come into play into the community plan.
So I've already been approved to have a flex code, but I haven't necessarily told any of the decision makers in the town what percentage I want to maintain in a more rural area versus what percentage I might want to make more urban-like or a PUD or anything like that.
Not the exact percentages, but they still have to operate within a certain spectrum. So if, for example, and these numbers probably aren't right, it's just coming from my memory, but if they submit a new community plan, they might have to have 20% T1 natural zone,
Okay.
minimum 20%. And maybe their T5, the more urban areas, is a maximum of 30%.
And that's in the ordinance.
And that's in the ordinance, yes. So they could effectively say, years down the line, hey, the market's changed. We don't think we need this much T5, this much urban. We have a maximum of 30%. We're going to do 25% instead, and we're going to reallocate 5% of our land area to T1.
And they can do that as long as they can do that as long as they stay within the
Yeah.
guidelines that are set in the ordinance.
Exactly, yes.
And it would be up to us to change, or whoever's sitting here, God knows how many years from now, to change the ordinances, those percentages within the
Yeah,
ordinances.
yeah. Down the line, if a new council or planning board doesn't agree with the percentages, yeah, it'd be a text amendment process.
Okay.
And if they wanted something that was outside of,
Can you come up to the mic,
okay,
Yeah, or there, one or the other.
if they wanted something that was outside,
Okay, Neil,
Sorry.
that's good.
if they wanted something outside of the codified, percentages, then they would have to ask for a variance, and that would come back through the public process as usual.
Okay, thank you.
So after they submit that new community plan and it meets all of our ordinance, then they just move on to your typical TRC submittals that you see, your development site plans for new businesses or subdivisions if they're subdividing land. The second option folks have is to rezone to transect districts as part of an infill community plan. So those transects, the T1 up to the T5 or T5 open, would operate in an infill plan as zoning districts. So the first option, the entire land area would be zoned flex code zone, and it would have a new community plan associated with it, much like a master land use plan and the PUD zoning. With option 2 here, you would have each land area, each parcel specifically zoned one of the transect zones. So this is what we're currently utilizing over here in the Gateway infill plan, where each property has its own zoning district that is a transect. So anybody that wants to change their zoning district would, one, have to make sure that they're meeting the requirements of their infill community plan, but two, would have to go back through that board approval process like a typical rezoning. You can also, just explained that part, you can also rezone to a standalone transect district. Standalone transect districts are useful when you have a property that's just on the fringe of a new community plan or a infill community plan, where they're seeing the type of development that's going on in the flex code areas, and they say, hey, I want to be a part of that, but I wasn't in for the new community plan or the infill community plan. Well, they can rezone to a standalone transect district. So they'll still be a part of the flex code area, but they'll be their own standalone transect district. So that's just a way to kind of capture the odd parcel here and there that might want to develop under the flex code.
Question about that. Since that goes through the public rezoning process, is it still subject to having to kind of tick through the transects, or would that be able to be zoned just like any other zoning?
Yeah, it would be zoned like any other zoning of, T1 to T5 or T5 open. So they'd come in and say, hey, planning department, I would like to be T4. I got this idea for this project. Staff would discuss with them, we see this as appropriate for the area or not as appropriate for the area, come through the planning board to council for a final approval there.
To follow up on that, but they'd still be within the flex code
Yeah.
zone, so they'd have to stick with, they couldn't say, I want to be R6
No.
Right.
No, this is only if they want one of those transect.
districts.
Yeah.
Got it.
So transect zones versus transect classifications. This is one of the changes we're proposing here. The difference between transect zones and transect classifications. A transect zone is what we currently have in the Gateway District. They operate the same as any other zoning district we might have, R6, C1. And they're appropriate for infill development, where we have a lot of existing conditions to take into consideration, and where we have a lot of different property owners. A transect classification is very similar to a transect zone, but they don't operate as their own zoning districts. So transect classification would be used in those new community plans, in those greenfield developments where we don't have any existing infrastructure, any existing structures, where the entire parcel or area is zoned to FCZ, Flex Code Zone, and those transect classifications appear on their regulating plan, still within the preset percentages. So this is kind of, the Transect classifications are kind of similar to the land uses in our PUD districts, where on a master land use plan, they might have call-outs for single-family grouping of homes here, some townhomes over here, commercial area over here, some civic space over here. Those uses that appear on the master land use plan aren't zoning districts in and of themselves, but they're still land use classifications. So that kind of development might not be appropriate for the Gateway District, where we have existing structure to take into account, but it is appropriate for infill development, those new greenfield development, those new community plans.
Ben, is there an advantage of one over the other?
Sure. So an advantage to transect zones when you have existing development is you know exactly what zone you're approving next to what is existing. So if you have, a bunch of really low density single family and a developer has this infill plan and they say, hey, we want our highest and most dense use right next to there, you can see and go, well, that's not exactly conducive to what is existing next door. So you have a little bit more control where you have existing infrastructure. The Transect classifications for new community plans, greenfield development, is useful in that if you have market changes, you don't have zoning districts that you need to change through a 2.5-month board approval process every single time something changes. You still have to operate within those percentages, but you can more freely move them around administratively rather than coming through a board approval process. So number 3 here, an increased height allowance for T5. And this kind of relates to item number 4 as well. So the current ordinance allows 5 stories for T5 transects. We're proposing 7 stories for T5. And this will be a little more, I'll give you some reason why in this next item, which is the introduction of a new transect zone classification, which is T5 open. So one half step above T5.
Ben, what's the highest height we have currently?
5 stories. 5 stories currently, yep. So the T5 open transect zone and classification. It's similar to T5 in use and form, except there'll be an increase in lot widths by about 100 foot, and that's to allow better accommodation for structured parking. So T5 open would be the most urban in our transects, allowing up to 12 stories, which is why we increased T5 to 7 stories, so that there's not so much of a difference between your T5 open to T5. We are proposing additional architectural requirements for those buildings over 7 stories. For example, step backs are going to be required. So if you're above 7 stories, your front yard setback would increase, pull from the street a little bit, just to make sure that the streetscape is staying open. You're not crowding it in with very tall buildings, making sure enough light's getting in, and also provide a little bit more private open space for that specific lot or structure.
Excuse me?
Yes.
So if you have a zone or classification T5 or T50, once you have that, then the ability to build a 7 or 12-story building is by right.
Correct, yes.
So they wouldn't have to do anything other than meet the architectural standards and permits and so forth. They would have that by right.
Yeah. So it'd go through the TRC process like any other subdivision or development site plan. T5 open would be allowed in smaller quantities than T5, so that kind of comes back to those percentages of each transect that might be required. You're not going to have as much T5 open as you would T5.
When you say that, it's troubling because who's setting that percentage?
Of the ordinance.
The ordinance is.
Mhm.
And the percentage is based on what? The overall land in the town of Leland at the time?
It would be based on the size of your pedestrian shed. So flex code development is done at the pedestrian scale. You have 3 different levels, I guess, or intensities of a pedestrian shed. You've got your CLD stand for now.
I forget.
Oh, no?
Yeah. It's a cluster land.
Clustered land development. So clustered land development's kind of the smallest flex code zone you could have. I think the minimum's 20 acres. Regional development is the larger pedestrian shed you can have with the most disparity in percentages. So if you had a regional development as your infill plan, it usually consists of, I think it's 300-ish acres. Within those 300-ish acres, you're going to have certain percentages of each of your transects that's allowed. So in that scenario, we wouldn't allow for X percentage, more than X percentage of T5 open, and we'd allow for a little bit more than that of T5.
So in picking round numbers, I have 500 acres of land. I want to build a 12-story condominium, but it's going to have to be along a major NCDOT thoroughfare. And there's going to be a percentage within that 500 acres of how much I can devote to that particular 12-story building and structured parking to go along with it. Is that correct?
Nearabouts, yeah. So the infill regulating plan, or sorry, the new community plan that would accompany that flex code zone
Mm-hmm.
would specifically call out their entire pedestrian shed as well as their intended areas and percentages of each of those transects. So if they had, along the northern border, if that was a major NCDOT thoroughfare, they might say, hey, I'm allowed 15% of T5 open. I've got 10% right here, right up against that thoroughfare, and I've got X percent of T5, X percent of T4 open, and it kind of reduces in transect intensity as you go out.
Have we considered potential problems of when you have two developments next to one another?
Like if you had
So
two regional
I've got two,
developments
I've
abutting
got
each
two,
other?
two 500-acre developments next to one another, bordering on one another, and both of them decide they want to use their 250 zoning next to one another.
Sure, so.
Now I'm looking like Viva Las Vegas.
So if a neighboring property owner wanted to do the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
you could have a scenario where the two T5s are right next, or two T5 open areas are right next to each other, but they're still going to be locked into those percentages, and they still have to do it based on a pedestrian shed, a 15-minute walk. So you might have together a larger area of T5, but you're also going to have the same percentages of those other transect districts.
And just as an urban design tool, actually, I would advocate for that's a good thing. You want it to cluster because then it means it has less impact on, you know, surrounding areas. Because if it's it's like a whole new downtown would be what that would be, as opposed to having that dispersed. Then as far as your life safety, your parks and open space, your public works, all of your other city, town responsible entities, if they could look at that as a clustered intensity rather than having a whole lot of those, it would actually make their jobs easier.
However, that makes somewhat of an assumption that the two 500-acre parcels are being developed somewhat at the same time. What if, for instance, one is 6-8 years before the other, and the higher story building is not put next to the other one? Now suddenly you don't have a cluster. So that's going to, I think, require the town or staff very carefully to make sure that clustering is able to be done when you have two parcels next to each other, correct?
It will take design work, yeah, and fortunately, y'all have some incredibly astute staff. Speaking as a consultant, you know, we've been working with y'all for decades now, and your staff continues to get better, and I can't say that about very many of my clients. So, you know, kudos to y'all.
Yeah, I remember your first visit.
Piggybacking off what Alan just brought up, if if we have by right abilities here, if a owner and developer has a by right design, then we are depending more on, as opposed to their brilliance, and I don't mean that sarcastically to our staff, and their capabilities, but we're almost relying on their persuadability than anything else. Because by right, the owner has the right to put his building, as long as he doesn't exceed the percentages anywhere within his infill.
As long as it's in a regional center,
Mhm.
first of all, that implies there's a lot of land, and, you know, at the moment, even as land rich as Leland is, you don't have an unlimited number of parcels that large.
Mhm.
And number two, that it's along a major NCDOT thoroughfare, and that's pretty limited in itself, so, yeah, there are some constraints on it.
But I think to kind of carry on from that too, you know, the concern I have here is it's one thing to have, say, 15% of a 500 acres, that's 75 acres, you know, you're talking about a small subset of buildings, but, you know, 15% of, say, 1,400 acres is 200 acres, and that's a massive potential road frontage and a massive strain on public infrastructure. I mean, we're getting pretty big in that conversation.
And there is a cap for those pedestrian sheds. So you couldn't have one pedestrian shed that's 2,000 acres and they pull percentages off of that. If you had a 2,000 acre parcel, you're probably going to end up with 4, probably more individual pedestrian sheds where those percentages are applied. So someone couldn't come in with a massive pedestrian shed, because it wouldn't be pedestrian scaled at 2,000 acres anymore. They couldn't come in with one giant pedestrian shed and put, you know, a mass of T5 open in one area. They'd have to split off into multiple smaller pedestrian
And they
sheds.
couldn't stack then the T5 into this single percentage. So if you've got, say, 4 of those on a property of that size, all 4 of them wouldn't be able to butt up against the road frontage to kind of create this situation, would you? I mean,
No, I think it would be you would have to have a very specifically sized and positioned parcel to get all of your T5 open lumped together, and I don't even think it would be possible.
because I'm just, you know, maybe you'll get to this later on in the presentation, but I'm just, you know, there's a lot of ways you can carve up a block, no matter its shape. I mean, you can draw those lines however you want. So what is the mechanism to, you know, push back? How are those pedestrian areas drawn out, I guess is the next
Sure.
question to.
Yeah, we get into that a little bit later. Oh, actually, number 6, block perimeters. But block perimeters are one of the main things. So for T5 open, it's 2,200 foot block perimeter. So that's 550 foot along all sides of your block to make sure that those more urban areas are kept at a walkable pedestrian scale. We've also got street design requirements such as your tree planting wells, your wider sidewalks in those more urban areas. When I say wider sidewalks, I'm not saying from 5 foot to 8 foot for like multi-use paths. I'm saying like 15, 20 foot sidewalks, those
Wow.
larger walkways that you would see in more urban developments, just to make sure that while the building scales increase, so do the pedestrian elements, so that it doesn't look out of place. And if you had a 12-story building and a 5-foot sidewalk, it'd look real funny. So there's other parts of the ordinance that forces folks to build better and have a pedestrian scape that makes sense for what development is flanking it. So there's a lot of other controls, architectural controls as well, built into the ordinance so that we, 1, know what we're going to get. We know it's going to work for the pedestrian. But 2, we're still giving some flexibility to a developer that might want to develop under this code, but may see it as too restrictive if they're not able to respond to market demands.
You might be getting to this later, but if possible, could you just give a little bit more clarification on what you mean by a pedestrian shed?
Sure.
For instance, I saw one place in here, it said 1 standard pedestrian shed, and it could have been for 640 acres. that just seems like an awful lot of walking in some respects to me, if it's a walkability aspect for 640 acres. So I just didn't quite understand the pedestrian shed aspect.
Yeah, so pedestrian sheds are kind of like watersheds. It's essentially an area where if you take the nucleus of it, it tends to be a 10, 15-minute walk to any other side of that pedestrian shed. So you're basing your development on a pedestrian shed so that you know you have that walkability to all areas within the pedestrian shed, within the developable area. So 640 acres is 1 square mile. So if you put yourself in the center of a square mile block, it's a half mile each way you go. Yes?
So, along with that, I didn't really see anything in here, addressing keeping land pervious, because the more I saw was wider sidewalks, more roads, buildings, but I didn't see a whole lot of discussion on pervious, because if you're going to a greenfield area that's currently 100% pervious, how does that take into play for the watershed area versus
Sure.
pedestrian shed?
Yeah, I don't think we have any requirements in there right now to require pervious sidewalks or parking areas. Kind of the idea behind a form-based code, this style of development, is to provide an area for a higher density of folks with a smaller footprint than we see in conventional zoning, where we have that urban sprawl, where you might have 100 residents that need a whole mile of roadway to serve, whereas under a flex code, you might have 100 residents that need a quarter mile of road to serve. So whereas in a specific locale, the percentage of impervious might be increased on a town-wide scale for the amount of residents it's serving, you would see a reduction in total pervious area.
But
Sorry.
go ahead, no, go ahead and answer first. You may answer my question.
Okay, there's also, as Ben has mentioned already, there's a certain amount of civic space and open space required. So like, is providing parks and open space, it's also requiring landscaped, like tree lawns, and there are maximums in each transect for total lot coverage. So there is a certain guaranteed pervious coverage within each transect. As Ben did mention, it becomes more impervious as you get into the higher zones, but because you have a certain amount required of T3 and T4, then it's guaranteeing a certain amount that's pervious.
To follow up on that, what you were talking about, density essentially, are we talking about an actual practical shift in the amount of pervious versus impervious, or are we just talking pervious versus impervious per capita?
That example I was using per capita, but like Susan was mentioning, you're still going to have a certain percentage pervious in each of your transect allocation areas, as well as the required civic space types tend to be more pervious than impervious.
Where are we taking into account the geography that we're building on when we talk pervious versus impervious? Because while this sounds like a great urban planning tool and public administration exercise, we are sitting on the coast in a hurricane zone on marshland. And so as we take away that the green space and put impervious surfaces down, we are going to create flooding issues, stormwater runoff issues. And so I think that's where our retired Corps of Engineer planning board member was going with there, because it's, we're talking 12-foot boulevard streets, which are beautiful. I mean, I've walked down many of them in my travels, but they also weren't on the coast. Okay,
Yeah.
So for a reason, probably. So I think you can't do one tool without, at least in our case, where we're located, making it part of the zone, or making part of the zoning requirements, to take that into account, because we're gonna create issues that we just don't wanna leave with to anybody behind us.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, like with existing development we have now, there's people operating under the flex code are still gonna be required to treat their runoff, be that in stormwater retention ponds, or typically in more urban areas, you might get different methods, underground methods, like sand filters, sand traps, that kind of thing. But I agree, no, there's definitely a concern for the increased, impervious surfaces in these higher density areas. Part of the the new community plans, as staff interact with developers that might want to undertake a project like that, would be looking at the existing conditions on the ground. So if we have an area of wetlands, that's going to be more ripe for the T1, the natural zone, akin to our conservation district.
Having been briefed on sacrificial surfaces or sacrificial landings in developments in my time on council, which fortunately didn't come to pass, I don't know that we should necessarily go by the goodwill of developers. I'll just say that for the record.
Ben, as far as the percentages of pervious versus impervious, who makes that decision and what would it be based on? Is there a state guideline,
So for the total allowable impervious in each of
Correct.
your lots,
Yes.
I mean, that's dictated by the ordinance, so,
Okay,
we
but
can definitely-
somebody put it in the ordinance, so
Yeah.
how was that determined?
through our conversations like we're having right now. So the original flex code I wasn't here for, but I would imagine that part of that conversation was those impervious total built upon areas that are allowable for each lot within a certain transect district. So we can definitely take a look perhaps at what some other towns of like size that have form-based codes are doing for their impervious, and see how it matches up to what we've currently got in our ordinance, and see if we can come up with some different ways to make sure that we're not creating flooding issues in the future by having too much impervious surface.
This
And
may,
Ben, did you say earlier that we already had structures under this flex code?
Yeah, we do. We've got Harrington multifamily over there,
Senior center.
right opposite, or right next to the medical center there. We've got the brewery over here, operated under the flex code, the building we're in now, and most recently we got that Habitat store right next to Woodburn Townhomes that's
And the emergency
using
room
it.
place or the emergency care place.
Yep, them and Woodburn Townhomes as well.
But all the units back in behind Lowe's, those new apartments back there. are any
Behind
of
Lowe's
the-
Hardware?
Pardon me?
yes.
Behind Lowe's Hardware? No, none
Yeah,
of those.
Lowe's Hardware, yeah.
Yeah, none of those operated underneath the flex
On
code.
the flex code.
That's all conventional
Gotcha, okay.
multifamily zoning districts out there.
And just one other point is that whatever gets developed under any zoning within the town has to comply with your stormwater design manual. So it's not excluded from that. Y'all do have control over it in that method.
Well, we have control over it with this too, because we
Yeah.
can add it in here.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and I realize I'm going off a planning board here shortly, but I'd really like to see us focus more on the stormwater issues in there, because we don't want to build something brand new, want it to be walkable, and then it flood, and the first floor, you've got first floor flooding, people can't walk to where you want them to be able to walk to, and we've got a chance to maybe make some good decisions right now. I mean, I know there's some requirements to a 25-year storm. Maybe we ought to be looking to a 100-year storm or larger, since we know that we've got a lot of flooding problems in the town already, and let's think smartly on anything new that we're proposing here.
You're gonna go out with a bang, right?
And particularly if we're talking more density, because we already know that the more density, the more concrete and steel we put into an area, the more we're going to impact the potential flooding and stormwater runoff. So, I don't see, I know we have a separate stormwater plan, but if we're going to write an ordinance specific to our flex code, I think that should be a consideration for anyone building particularly if we're even going to consider any increase in densities like this, and this is a major increase, more than doubling, that should be part of the consideration.
Yes, I would fully agree with that too, because just as a quick example, if you think of a rather high-density area, the Aventura area of Miami, Florida is very dense, and they just had major flooding, and it wasn't a hurricane.
Right.
And it wasn't even a tropical storm. So I think that's a very good point, that we'd have to be very careful on that.
And you know, I grew up in New York, and we never had flooding when I grew up as a kid. And now it seems like every storm that it consists of more than 3 or 4 inches, the subways are flooding. And that never, ever happened when I was a kid,
Well,
So-
to add to that, we live in a world now where they can create pervious concrete and sidewalks and parking lots. I mean, we've got opportunities with the technology available to us to address these things right now and still be able to achieve some of the goals that,
Which is why I think it's crucial that if you want to go, I'm not saying, I'm not going to try to keep an open mind here, but if you're going to do that, then require folks to take that into account, not in a separate ordinance, but in this ordinance.
right, or make the impervious versus pervious requirements high enough that it becomes the natural solution.
Correct.
Yeah, definitely, all good ideas there. Yeah, we'll take a look at other municipalities to see if maybe they've figured it out, or if they're on a path that's
Particularly on the
getting there.
coast.
And yeah, along the coast, and kind of see if there's any best management practices there that we can write into the code.
How did Savannah do it?
And
Yeah.
that's exactly the city I was thinking of.
Savannah, they say Savannah.
One thing I just want to be a little more specific on, when we're talking about flooding issues and stuff, we are focused more so on built upon area as opposed to density, right? Density doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have more built upon area.
Right, I think the
Those-
assumption is that
Yeah,
with the density is going to come an increase in impervious surface.
Sure.
But, I mean, it can't help but, when you're sitting here looking at structured parking, in terms like that, 12-story buildings, you can't help but get to the other part, One leads to
Oh,
the
yeah.
other.
Yeah, I'm just saying if you have like the same amount of people in a
Yeah, we're not
single-family
necessarily,
development, then you'll-
talking just density.
Yeah,
As
okay.
opposed to the type of structures that you're presenting is what
Gotcha.
has
Just wanna make
led
sure
to
I'm on
this
the same track.
discussion. Yeah.
Alrighty. Any more on this one before we?
Yeah, I just have one more
Yeah.
question. Up to 12-story buildings, does that mean that new emergency apparatus will be needed by the town?
Sure.
That's my note. You reading my notes here, huh?
Yeah, but I think we're all on that same sheet of music. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I had some brief discussions with our fire chief, Ronnie Hayes, and our previous fire chief, Chris Langlois, and the general gist I was getting from them is up to a certain height, it will be serviced by a ladder truck, but typically once you're over 6 or 7 stories, it's fought from the inside. You're going to have sprinkler requirements, and I suppose that the best fire practices are to fight it from the inside as opposed to aerial on a ladder truck.
I would think, and Lord knows I'm not a fire person, but I've been in many a tall building that has had to evacuate. I would think that would mean an increase in the number of firefighters and equipment we would need, because generally, as you're a person evacuating out of those tall buildings, there are firemen and hoses going up the ladder as you're going, or going up the stairs as you're going down the stairs. And that takes a lot more bodies and equipment than, even if it's not the type of equipment, it's certainly more of the equipment and more of the people, because they're more labor intensive. You just can't get up those stairs without the number of bodies required.
Kind of like it was in Winston-Salem when they had to.
Yeah, when it went off, yeah.
Went off, and we had to get out, and you had to walk down, what, 10 flights?
Yeah.
So, that is a concern as well.
Alrighty.
Just something to think about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, definitely need to have some more conversations with Ronnie and Chris,
Right.
just to see what information they might have there. Another change is removal of density limitations.
Whoa, okay, go ahead.
So, yeah, now that's it. We're on to the next one.
You scared me for a second
Yeah.
here, go ahead.
So currently, our ordinance has specific dwelling units per acre for all of the transect districts, and of course, it gets more intense further down those transects that you go. The issue with density is it's not a very easy thing to visualize. So we're proposing to remove the density allowances because density tends to be regulated, well, is regulated by other requirements within the ordinance, such as parking, total allowable built upon area in your lots, things like that. Building height, lot width maximums as well. When you put all these elements together, there's a building envelope left for a developer to work with. And ultimately, the density is determined by the developer's pro forma and how big the individual units are. So the next slide here is just a picture. On the surface, if you're walking by, it looks like 3 units, right? 3 dwelling units. These look like townhomes or subdivided single-family homes. But realistically, past that front door, it could be more than just 1 unit. I mean, this could be 2 units each, so 6 units right there just in these 3 homes. Density is difficult to visualize. It's a lot easier to visualize the form of the structures, the heights, where the parking can be located, the width of your lots, how much of that lot width you can actually build out, things like that, as opposed to just relying on a density cap.
Looks like shotgun houses down in Charleston.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we've got plenty of these in downtown Wilmington. When I used to live down there, I lived opposite a house that, if you just look at it, looks like a big single-family house, but it was split up into, gosh, I don't even know how many, 7, 8, or
Apartments,
something
yeah.
like that, apartments. And it worked really well because you fit a good amount of people in there. The rents were definitely lower in that house specifically, and you really couldn't tell that it was housing that many units. It just looked like a regular single-family home.
Unless the 24 cars parked out front gave you,
Well, it was street parking, so luckily that it didn't really make a difference to me. They had some parking in the rear, but you know, it was out of sight, out of mind. But just walking down the street, you'd never know. So using design elements, lot widths, built upon area, height maximums, frontage requirements, what the front entryway looks like, using design elements that really matter to the pedestrian is a much more effective way to regulate density than simply just telling a developer you can do 36 per acre and letting them figure it out. It gives us a little bit more predictability. It lets the developer really focus in on, well, what density do I need, and can I get that with these design requirements, these parameters in the code?
May I add to that?
Absolutely.
And to Ben's point, I just want to elaborate a little bit because he was very clear, but there are a couple of mathematical equations that have been used in the last 50 years that were never used before. One is dwelling units per acre or density, and the other is FAR or floor area ratio. And both of those are just mathematical. And they, in most everywhere we work, they actually contradict the other density, very clear density regulations that you have, which are lot area, lot coverage, building height, setbacks. Setbacks is a huge contributor to density control, and parking requirements. So if you have all those things together, when we first did your gateway district, we did some modeling of existing, what you could do on the lot then versus what the flex code would allow you to do on the lot. And it was just showing that building envelope. And so the building envelope is what people care about. And they don't really care if your adult kid lives in the attic or your granny, you're taking care of her and she lives in the ADU in the back. Because what matters is if your building looks like the building across the street. And so instead of layering on this arbitrary mathematical formula, the thing that your constituents, the residents of Leland really care about is what does the building, does it complement its neighbors. And so as we're in this huge housing crisis nationally, and y'all are seeing an anticipated triple in your population over the life of your master plan, you've got to put them somewhere, and if you put them all in single-family detached, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to maintain that infrastructure. If you can consolidate it in logical locations, then, and one way to do that is by ridding yourselves of the density calculation. Because you're controlling density very, very predictably with the building envelope standards.
Makes sense.
All righty, thank you, Susan. Any more conversations, questions on that one, on the density stuff before we move on?
I think that, again, I feel like I'm in a master's program in public administration or something,
Yeah.
with housing, which is a good and bad thing, Susan, thank you. Because when you say the words controlling density, you're controlling the aesthetics, you're not controlling the density. While it will look like this, you still have 3 times the population. And yes, you do cut down on some infrastructure costs, et cetera. You still have those cars, you still have those bodies, you still have all those people trying to get around in the same area, using the same public parks, using the same public sidewalks, walking trails, whatever else you have. And so you haven't exactly controlled density. You've controlled the aesthetics of the density of what it looks like.
This photo is a great example of that. I mean, if these homes are single-family homes, you're looking at 6 to 9 vehicles added. If these are quadplexes, you're looking at 48.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's,
And potentially 48 cars.
That's what
and
I mean, 48
yeah,
vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. You know.
and that's where things get dicey, because while I agree that there's a lot of resident concern about community character and building envelope, I think traffic is probably on the same level, if not a greater concern. And this is talking about tripling the population and potentially putting 1/3 of that triple into a very small area on some areas that are already under a great deal of infrastructure pressure as it is. So that's what I think the crux of the concern we're getting at is.
Yeah, again, to me, it's kind of superficial stuff that we're focusing on. No offense to the planning board, because I know they do that kind of structural stuff, but there's services, doctors, pharmacies, supermarkets, parks, schools, which is not in our level of government, but still, all of those things feed into that controlling of density, because as you're increasing your density, you are increasing your needs for all of those things without actually taking any of them into account. And so it's got to be a comprehensive kind of approach to it. And so if you build it, they will come may not necessarily be the right approach.
And as a municipality, there's only so many levers we can pull. Density is a lever we have control over. NCDOT infrastructure is not.
And it's broken.
Water infrastructure is not. Education is not. Hospitals are not. Doctors are not. Businesses are not.
Mhm.
I mean, there's very little we can do, but there's a lot we can do to put the cart in front of the horse and create problems.
Yes.
Well, the unit, going back behind Lowe's Hardware again, I call them tiny homes. What do you refer to
Oh,
them
the
as?
Cape Cottages?
Cape Cottages, yeah.
Where they're all kind of individual units.
That's gonna give us a look at what you're talking about to some extent pretty soon, isn't it?
Yeah, I think they're about halfway built out, maybe a little further, and about halfway full. So they're,
How many cottages, do you know?
that is, I think it's 306, something like that, on, I want to say, maybe 60 acres, give or take. They're essentially like an apartment, if you exploded an apartment building into
Right.
its individual units. But that kind of gives an idea on character.
Yeah.
It's not flex code exactly, but it's certainly closer than our other apartment uses for sure. One thing that the flex code or this style of development does that I think is holds its weight is the requirement of the different transects and having a mix of residential, commercial, and civic uses within a walkable area. There's very little in North Carolina currently that we can do for affordable housing, but one way to make housing affordable is to reduce the cost of other services. So if you live in an area where your basic needs, your grocery store, your doctor's office, things like that are in a walkable distance, suddenly a 2-car household might not need to be a 2-car household. It might only need to be a 1-car household. That would be the case for me if I was living in an area like this for sure. So you can kind of help alleviate housing prices by providing an area that gives those services in a walkable method or in an area where it's easier to implement transit options, right? The more spread out you are, the more sprawl you have. Transit is a very difficult thing to do because it's just costly to drive all over the place. But if you have a more compact development, transit suddenly becomes a lot easier. Shorter travel distances, not as many pickups, that type of thing. So there's ways to promote reducing reliance on the automobile with these kind of development standards to where typically, if you got 2 parents and a kid that's 15 years or older, you're going to have probably 3 cars at your house. But if you're living in here, maybe you don't need all 3 of those cars.
But we can achieve a lot of those goals at 5 and 7 stories. We don't have to be at 12, right?
Sure. Yeah. Could do. But that's kind of just one of the things I find very interesting and cool about the flex code is the idea of not having to drive everywhere, which I think is a very common development standard in America right now.
And that would assume that we had some form of transit system.
Sure. But you can't have transit system before you have transit-ready areas.
You probably need 12
Well-
stories for that.
Or you could, but it's going to be very costly.
But you have to be careful not to get that cart before the horse.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And we already know that there are limitations into how DOT works, how quickly they work and how they work. And so while we can certainly implement things to help with our designation of being one of the fastest growing towns in the country, we don't necessarily need to do that at the risk of not having the schools and the hospitals and the supermarkets and the streets that can handle that density. And so, again, is it 12 stories the answer? Just, if they build it, they will come? Yeah, they probably will. And that's the scary part.
The opposite of if you build it, they will come, how about if you don't build it, then they won't come?
And again, I think it's gonna get built. It's just a matter of how much and how tall. I mean, we're talking density here. We're not necessarily talking not building. We're talking getting as many into a smaller area as we can in a planned type of environment. But we don't control all the planning.
Yeah, we have no control over the schools or anything like that.
So that's the problem. And I think that's the balance that we are juggling here. We can plan and build to our heart's content, but if everything else can't keep up with us, and we know that, then are we being responsible?
It goes back to what I was saying about levers, there are certainly large buildings that all of us in the entire community could be in favor of. I mean, I'm sure if somebody wanted to come and build a hospital tower, that would have widespread support. But creating this development by right takes all of that control out of the community's hands and hands it into the by right use of the land. And that's just us giving up another lever.
Can you think of any incentives you would like to use? Like if you restricted the height to a lower number, and then if the developer did X, Y, or Z, you would be willing to give them another story? Have you ever considered that sort of technique?
I think we talked about
We
that a
did
little
talk
bit
about that,
recently,
yeah.
but you know, I think that's a great step, and that's sort of, you know, a split the baby type of deal. But I would much rather be in a position where if you want to build a big building, you've got to present it to the community and get approval for it. You know, because I think if somebody comes in here and wants to build a couple of 12-story condo towers, that's going to be wildly unpopular from the majority of the community. But if somebody wanted to do some sort of mixed use, you know, that contained several other facets, you know, 12-story building, but 4 stories is apartments, 2 stories is medical offices, and you've got a movie theater and a bowling alley and all that, I think that's a win. But again, we're just making it easier for private interests to come in and do whatever they want, and harder for public interests to have any control over what comes. And I don't think that's the direction we want to keep moving in.
But are you saying then that if somebody wants to build, that perhaps they should get public input and comment to that? Does that now interfere with the build by right?
Oh, it certainly does.
So now where do you draw the line?
Yeah, I think having
The sand is shifting.
I think having those caveats is definitely important. Like the example you just used is a much better community service than strictly a 12-story condominium. I would certainly like to hear from you all today, after when you've had some time to chew on it, what criteria you think would be really important in making those decisions. Because one fear I have on, you know, someone just coming to the sphere of public opinion for those is not having a repeatable decision-making process and getting into that gray area of, well, you let the other guy do it because he had a movie theater and you're not letting me do it because I only got a bowling alley or something like that. So I think it would be really, really good to kind of hone in on some criteria that everybody deems appropriate for those different height levels. So we can write it into the ordinance and kind of get that predictability in there, so that we don't get any difference in opinion with the current board and council to a future board and council.
Well, I'm
if that
sort
makes
of
sense.
where my mind is a conditional zoning type process, where you can build up to X. You know, we can figure out a reasonable height that isn't going to increase, you know, cost on today's residents for expansion of services, and figure that out, and that's your by right. And then there's a conditional process for anything that goes beyond that. You know, show us the community need for whatever it is you want to build, you know, a tower for, and make that part of a discussion. I mean, I think you're not stomping on by right at that point, because you're creating the by right standard and then allowing for a process that exceeds it, should there be a practical purpose. And, you know, that's my mind goes to medical facilities, right? I think that's it, because I just don't see Leland today being ready for something like this. And if we open this door, we don't get to say Leland today isn't ready for this. It is, and it's coming. And that's, you know, where my concern stems from.
My concern with what you just said is, again, the subjective versus objective criteria. And I realize legally, I saw our town attorney lean forward in his foxhole when you said that. But I also would like to see, if we're going to add some sort of public good to a criteria, we haven't really talked about affordability and workforce. I mean, yeah, I've read all of the various policy pieces on the fact that density theoretically brings about more affordable housing and that type of thing. But there's also an ability perhaps to say that if you want that extra floor, a certain percentage must be within a certain median income, workforce housing or affordable housing. We haven't really talked about that, but those are the folks that would probably benefit the most from having a walkable, higher density, I don't need a second car type of development. And so we haven't really discussed that within the flex code. And I turn to Brian and say, I don't know how legal that is, but.
Yeah. Nor do I, if at all.
Okay.
The General Assembly has been very clear that they don't want municipalities dictating what goes on within homes. And I can't imagine that they would give us a blank check on allowing something, particularly as a matter of right, if the purchase price is at a certain point. Now, they may, and Ben, Andrea, or you, if you guys are aware of a statute that I'm not aware of, let me know. I've not had any personal experience on that, but to say if you sell at this price point, you're permitted, that is a matter of right. I'm not aware of any.
No, I don't think that we have the ability, but I also don't think that it's been tested in the court of law about regulating based on price point. But if we're
Right.
talking about rentals, that's something different. That's
Right.
that's inclusionary zoning. And so in North Carolina, that also a mandate for inclusionary zoning still hasn't been tested in court. There are a couple municipalities that have it as a requirement that I think we're kind of waiting to see what happens. But to do it from an incentive standpoint, that is something that can be done. So to say you can go to this number of stories or to this level of density if you provide this. So it's not creating a requirement that you provide it, it's a give and take. And
And
as
that's
far
more
as
of
I
like
know,
a special use type permit.
well, no, it's more of just an incentive. Same way if we said you can have, I don't know, some extra thing in your development if you do all of your stormwater with LID. So it's,
Right.
you know, it's comparable to that.
Like most things, the devil will be in the details.
Right.
And as the case law evolves and the General Assembly may enact additional statutes, so. But you're spot on objective versus subjective. I mean, staff needs to be able to look at something that's subjective. The more discretion you vest in staff, the more likely it is subject to attack.
And stepping back for a second, it might be a little repetitious. When we talked, when Mr. McHugh was talking about, you know, like some kind of conditions to be able to go further, what's good for the community, one cannot forget that those conditions also are things that the community cannot control. And that goes to the infrastructure, the traffic, you know, the state roads and so forth, the utilities, so, the stormwater and stuff. My whole career was as a developer, and believe me, I think you said you can't leave it to developer. I agree with that, because if you give me something by right, all I'm gonna try and do is make money. And it, you know, if you can't control the rest of it, whether it's, you know, DOT or whatever, that's an issue. So that should have to be part of the quote-unquote conditions you would consider is, can the infrastructure handle, even if it's good, bring in a movie theater, can the infrastructure handle it?
Sure. And part of that process that we currently have that would still ring true in the Flex Code is that traffic impact analysis, which captures local roads, private roads, and DOT roads as well.
With
So
all due respect, Ben, you know, we can argue that one, but I don't have a great deal of faith, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in the TIA process. I'm still waiting for my answer back from DOT on whether or not they take two proposals that are taking effect on the same road into account when they do their study. If they're both being built at the same time on the same road, do they realize that they're both of those processes are gonna impact that road, or are they looking at them one at a time? I remember getting a very convoluted answer from, when we had DOT here a few years back, that never really answered my question, because I think the answer wouldn't have been what we necessarily wanted the public to know. So, yeah, theoretically, the traffic impact should do that, but it apparently doesn't do a really good job of it here in North Carolina, so.
Talk to Chad about that at the MPO meeting this month.
I know I'm going, I can't wait. I'm writing down my questions.
It's his last meeting with us, so.
That's true, I can leave him with a bang.
if it helps with your questions for him, I know in a section of the TIAs, we typically have a background growth, and it lists typical projects or general background growth rates, so maybe that's the part you can hone in on him with. All right. So if there's no more on that, I'll move on to some easier ones.
So you think,
Let's see about that.
so you
Give it a
think,
shot.
go ahead.
What is easy about your job, Bill?
I'm speaking it into existence. Block perimeter and exceptions. So this is just another way to kind of control the pedestrian scale of these areas is by having a block perimeter maximum. So this would be adding all four sides of a block together. In your less urban areas where folks aren't really walking around to their grocery store because it's primarily going to be residential, you'll typically have those larger blocks. As you get to your more urban areas, they tend to center around 500-ish, in this case 550 feet per block perimeter or per block length, 2,200 feet for the whole perimeter. In creating some of these block perimeter maximums, some things that we were considering were how many times do we want someone to cross a road, right? You want it to be pedestrian scaled so they can still walk, but you don't want them to cross, a travel lane every 10 steps. It's just unnecessary crossing times. That looped into it, the size of our the size of our parcel widths for each of the transects also played into it. So the blocks are slightly larger in T4 open and T5, and they're the same in T3 and T4. T1 and T2, T1 being like the conservation type areas, T2 being more of your rural residential. Those areas, there's no maximum on your block lengths because the block structure in those districts, well, certainly in T1, but T2 as well, don't really bear true with that style of development. You only start getting to your block styles when that T3 and onwards. Alrighty.
Question,
So, yes.
You initially said that T50 was like 12 stories and parking decks. What exactly would T4 open look like for story-wise? Number of stories?
T4 open should be 3 or 4 stories. I think 4 stories.
Because we had 5 is max now.
Mhm.
Then we talked about going from 5 to 7 on something, and then from 7 to 12. So is T4 open?
It's not changing, but I'll look it up for you.
Okay. But it's T4 versus T4 open, because the
T4 is just, it's basically blended density. It might have single family, it might have townhouses.
Okay.
So it's a blended density. And T4 open permits some very small scale neighborhood services and retail, like a coffee shop or a cafe. And so the open just means the uses expand a little bit, the character doesn't.
but not the height.
Yeah,
Okay,
correct. Let me look it up.
all right.
I had made myself a little table to try to understand it all, and originally T40 was 3 to 4, and it's going to 3.
Okay.
And T5 was 3 to 5, and it's going to 7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, T5 is where the bump starts.
Right. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, 3. Okay, yeah, so 3 for T4 and T4 open to up to 7 T5 and then T5 open the 12. I think in our current ordinance there's 2 tables where T4 open says 3 stories and another one where it says 4, but to my understanding that should have been 3 all along. So one of the administrative fixes through this process as well. So there are some block perimeter exceptions. The main reason for this is for those areas where you won't be able to get a connection. So if you're up against a controlled access highway, or for areas where we might not want a connection when you're up against an environmental feature like a wetlands or pond or something like that. So there are a few exceptions to our block perimeters when you're faced with site conditions out of your control.
Recently, the state redesignated what is considered a wetland versus what isn't.
Correct. Yeah.
how does that impact? I'm not in agreement with the state, but, you know, I took an oath to supporting the Constitution of the state Constitution and obey its laws, so, such is life. But the word wetlands just happens to be smack in the middle of that paragraph that you put over there, so it just called to me to comment. As we, again, are focused on building with more density and building with less pervious surfaces, or possibly replacing pervious surfaces or environmental features, what are we gonna call, what definition are we gonna use for a wetland? The states?
I would have to see if a local municipality has any birth in going with a definition that differs from the state. Not too sure on that one. I think the intent, or how I would apply this block perimeter exception, would be to wetlands as a whole, whether they're jurisdictional or not jurisdictional wetlands. I don't think we want to force a connection through a wetland just because it's not classified by the state as a wetland having significant nexus to a water of the U.S. I think there's great importance in maintaining our isolated wetlands. Personally speaking, isolated just means it's not connected to a larger body of water, but I don't think that degrades its ecosystem functions at all. But I'd have to see if we can adopt a stricter definition of wetlands in the state.
I don't think we can, because isn't there a law, Brian, that keeps us from adopting a more strenuous?
My suggestion would be to wetlands as determined by the state and federal agencies.
Yeah.
It's that relatively recent Supreme Court case that do the whole wetland thing. The name of the case escapes me at this point. It was within the last year or so, but
I don't think there would be any issue with us not requiring a connection through a wetland that might not be jurisdictional to the state standards.
yeah,
Yeah, definitely something to look
not
into.
requiring it versus if they want. I guess the issue would arise though if someone
They
wants
wanted it, yeah.
wants it, and
And we tell them no, because
tell
we
them
consider
no.
it's too wet.
because we would like a broader definition of what wetlands are than what the state and federal authorities say it is. That's where the issue would.
That would be where the issue came in, and again, I'm thinking stormwater runoff, I'm thinking flooding. You know, if we're saying, no, we wanna preserve that area because we realize that, you know, during rain episodes or during, deals, storms, whatever, that area tends to get wet and stay wet. But it's not technically anymore considered a wetland and it can be developed on. And the developer says, well, no, tough, you know, I can develop on that now based on state law. What power do we have to preserve it, if any?
Well, if it's not and I don't want to give legal advice and
I know, in an open
to the
court.
world,
Yeah,
because that's more than likely going to be a
court case.
fact-intensive look on a case-by-case basis. The concern would be if the state and the United States doesn't deem it a wetland, but we deem it to be so, does that constitute a taking? But again, that's so hypothetical and theoretical at this point, it's kind of dangerous. But if the goal here is to not require someone to cross, we're in great shape.
Yeah, that's it. This is an exception to the block
Right,
maximum, so it's saying you don't have to cross it.
right. So, I mean, I think that takes all that other analysis off the table. This is why people don't like lawyers, by the way.
I like
One
lawyers.
of
Some of my
those.
best friends are lawyers, to use that old saying.
Mine too, and I still
Love
don't
you,
like them.
Brian. And we
Alright.
love you too, Bill.
So any more on this one? All right. So utility location requirements, also an update here. So having specific requirements for the location of underground utilities. So one of the items that our engineering department and public works department find very important is not having those utilities located in the travel lanes, and that's for a number of reasons. One, so when work is going on those utilities, you don't have to shut down the entire road. Maybe you can get away with just one lane or operating solely in the off the side of the curb or within parallel parking spaces. And the other is preventing excessive patching of those travel lanes. Anytime you have to work on something, you got to patch it over, and you end up with those streets that look like a big hodgepodge of asphalt colored camouflage. So we're proposing having the wet utilities placed outside of the travel lanes, so that would be between the edge of the curb or on-street parking, all the way to the edge of the sidewalk. So still within the right-of-way, but outside of those travel lanes where the cars are using mostly. The dry utilities we're proposing at the rear of the buildings, and this is to provide a little bit more space in that right-of-way for the wet utilities that need to run along with those roads. But these dry utilities, your electric, gas, cable, that kind of stuff, would be at the rear of the buildings, reducing the likelihood of private utility companies needing to come in and close travel lanes or block existing parking. So a little change here. We're also updating and adding some civic space types. So we're adding a conservation park. As I go through these civic space types, they're pretty much ordered in less dense or less urban to more urban. So conservation park being our least urban, our most rural type of park. It's 8 acres in minimum, and it's intended for conservation. You might have your mulch trails, restroom pavilion, things like that, but it's intended to be very low impact. Park is an existing civic space type, and it's being added to the T5 open zoning classification and district as well. So these are a little bigger in size, about 5 acres minimum. You can have them in any one of the districts, and typically you're going to have planted, pervious, some non-pervious paths, gathering areas, maybe some sports facilities, something like that. We also have a green, which is a little bit smaller in size, 1/2 acre minimum, 5 acre maximum. This is going to be a little bit less pervious. You'll have a 15% maximum paved area, with pervious paving recommended, and a lot more tree canopy coverage in these greens. Getting a little more urban here is a square. Similar sort of size, 1/4 acre minimum, 4 acre maximum, 50% maximum paved areas, and again, making sure that we have a good mature canopy.
So in both of those, pervious paving is recommended, not required?
Correct. We have Plaza, which is also an existing civic space type, just expanding it to the T5 open category as well. Getting a little bit smaller in size here, 1/8 acre minimum, 3 acre maximum. Again, we've got some paved requirements, pervious paving recommended. This one's going to be a little bit more built out, a little bit more paved than your other civic space types. We also have adding a new civic space type here with neighborhood multi-purpose field, just providing a civic space type that can accommodate for recreation facilities. We have a greenway. This is typically a civic space type that's going to kind of fill the gaps and connect areas of town with essentially a green, a linear green with some pedestrian walking paths, that kind of thing. Another one of our new civic space types is a pocket park, designed to fit those smaller areas and provide some small-scale community services. Another one of our existing that we're expanding to T5 open as an option is a community garden. I think that one speaks for itself. It's a garden for the community. And we also have pedestrian passage. So this is almost like a very wide sidewalk, planted center, trees along it as well. And again,
Ben, I'm sorry, could you go
Yes.
back to the one that said solar opportunity? Solar exposure, okay.
mhm.
Okay,
Yeah, it's just making sure that there's enough sunlight. for
Sunlight,
those-
got
yeah,
it.
Exactly. Yeah.
next,
Mhm.
just making sure we're not talking solar farms or anything.
Oh, yeah. And then the pedestrian passage, continuous paved walkway required, opportunistic plantings. Again, providing pedestrian connectivity throughout the more urban scapes. We are also updating some of our private frontage types. So private frontages are the design elements that exist on the private property side. So you can think of one easy example is like a stoop as an architectural private frontage. So we're adding some, updating some of the graphics for these. So gallery is one of our existing, but we're adding it to the T5 open as well, and specifying a little bit more of those design requirements for a gallery type frontage. Forecourt is also an existing private frontage type, again expanding it to the T5 open category as well.
Ben, on these buildings with the canopies and so on, your setback goes back to the building or to the extended part of the building?
So
The canopy or whatever you want to.
yeah, some of these private frontage types, like an awning,
Yeah.
for example,
Mhm.
can encroach past the setback for a very specific amount, 2 or 3 feet, I think. Some of your frontage types would exist solely within the setback on the private property. So it kind of depends which frontage type we're talking about. Like a forecourt, for example, is likely not going to encroach past the setback, but your awning type would.
So if you had a building with let's say a balcony,
Mhm.
the setback goes to the front of the balcony or to the building itself?
In that case, it would be to the building itself.
Hmm.
There's a whole list of tables in the flex code that, in a section that talks about encroachments
Mhm.
and different building attachments. Some of them can encroach a certain amount into the setback, and some of them, like awnings, can encroach to within a certain distance of the sidewalk. I mean, of the curb. So, like you see in downtown Wilmington, you know, a lot of those awnings come all the way out of the sidewalk to shade the pedestrians.
There's 128 pages to this presentation. I didn't read all of them, but
Yes, sir.
you know. But I am aware of a town close by, and somebody wanted to, on their second floor, put a small step-out balcony off a bedroom. Unfortunately, they did it without approval, and then they had to take it off because it was encroaching beyond the setback. Now, it was up on the second floor. It wasn't, you know, you weren't going to bump your head on it, but so that's why I was asking the question.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, we're coming up on past 90 minutes. Could we take maybe a 5-minute break, stretch break?
Well, we got someone that really needed to leave at 11, so
Oh.
that's what I was waiting
We're
for.
waiting for, okay, my bad.
Are we okay to take a
Okay.
break?
If you want to take a break.
No, if we've got to leave at 11, look, I'll drive on. Actually, I was thinking of
Alright.
you guys sitting there kind of,
Let's take a 5-minute. and we'll-
I thought they were bringing brunch.
Oh, okay.